Good morning, everybody. It is another beautiful day in South Florida. And there's a lot of national things happening today. I'll tell you, I'm very, very excited. And as a foodie, I'm excited that it is National Chili Day. Natasha is here with me, Natasha Timberlake.
Hello,
She was
everyone.
telling me that she actually made chili last night. You didn't get the memo, did you? Today was maybe leftover chili tonight?
Yes,
No.
sounds like a plan.
Can the GI tract handle chili 2 nights in a I don't know.
I
We'll have
don't
to
know.
save
But
that
the kids
for
love it, so there we go.
right. National Toast Day. Toast is good. National Banana Bread Day.
That's really good.
Does anybody have those bananas sitting? Am I the only one that goes and buys a big bushel of bananas and then has that moment of I better do so? Yeah, right. Exactly. But the one thing today that we're so very excited about, it is National Dog Biscuit Day.
Yay.
Toby Hall, tell all your dog friends it's National Dog Biscuit Day. He looks so impressed. Are you impressed? No, he's definitely not impressed. Okay. So, Natasha, thank you so much for coming on the show today to talk about neoplasms.
Yes, I'm excited.
Oh, I'm excited too. I know that that's an area that we were talking before. It's an area that as a risk adjustment coder, I see a lot of errors. I see a lot of and honest errors, right? Because there's so many rules.
Yes, there are a lot of rules.
How do we know all those rules? It's kind of challenging. So we're talking about the guidelines, section 1, subsection C, like Charlie for the chapters. We're entering into chapter 2. And that is going to be our neoplasm. It also kind of goes a little bit on chapter 3, the bloodborns, except there's no guidelines for the bloodborns. So I'm glad that we got a little bit of that in this chapter.
But there is small guidelines with certain diagnosis codes in chapter 3.
That's right. That's right. Within the tabular section there. Yeah. So first thing, I always want to kind of clear the air when we talk about neoplasms. Neoplasm is just an abnormal cell growth.
Yes.
So is it cancer? Could be. Is it not cancer? Right?
Yeah.
That's what we're going for.
Yes.
So to go through some of those harsh definitions there, the primary neoplasm, that is where the cancer cells originate from. And those are cells that they can spread. Not all of them choose to. Not everyone is that overzealous and says, hey, I'm going to spread. Some of them don't. But the primary neoplasm is that originating cell. So fun fact, I know someone, she's doing great, by the way, but I know someone who had a mammogram and it came back positive.
Oh,
they did a biopsy and they found cancerous cells, sent her off to one of the big hospitals.
Okay.
When they analyzed those cells, Natasha, they were actually lung cancer cells.
And so metastasized into breast cancer.
Right, to the breast.
Yes.
So the primary neoplasm was lung cancer.
And you don't see that very often going from lung to breast. Usually it's breast to somewhere else or lung to somewhere else, but I haven't really seen that too often, that it goes from lung to breast.
But that's where we identified that the breast was that secondary neoplasm. So you want to pop that secondary definition up there? Yeah, it's where the primary neoplasm is spread to. It's metastasized to. And the other kind of cancer is the in situ cancer. That one, or in situ, I'm never going to pronounce it properly. It just depends on the group that you're with, I think. And basically those are where you've got pre-malignant, malignant cells that they stay where they are. They don't spread. They're in the tumor. So if we can take the tumor out, wonderful, right?
Yes.
So a couple of other definitions. This one really is a fun one. The uncertain versus the unspecified. Now, I don't know about you, Natasha, but lately, because of the new E&M guidelines, I see providers getting confused with an undiagnosed condition with uncertain prognosis versus uncertain neoplasms.
Yeah, I see that too. Especially with skin cancers. I usually see when they're doing like the Mohs surgery or the biopsy, it's like uncertain behavior of the skin because they're unsure if it's benign or neoplastic. So they know it's from the skin, but they're unsure. But unspecified is like, I usually see that from like the lateralities, like unspecified, which breast it came from, or unspecified which lung. Usually with the lateralities, I usually see for the unspecified. So you got to be really careful of how it's documented because they're completely different.
Most definitely. And I think that, uncertain really hits it on the head. We don't know.
Yeah.
And I mean, excuse me, unspecified. Ooh, see how easy it is to confuse those words. So unspecified, again, there's we don't know.
Yeah.
Where uncertain, that's always been described to me that a pathologist has looked at it and that the pathologist is uncertain of the morphology, maybe teetering on premalignant, malignant, right? Or maybe teetering on benign, premalignant there, where they're not quite sure of that morphology yet.
Yes.
So just truly understanding. Yes, Betty Hovey. Can you put Betty's post up there? There we go. Betty's reminding us that uncertain diagnosis is from a pathological determination.
Yes, I agree, Betty.
Right. So I can't make that decision that it's uncertain. And if the provider hasn't sent it off to pathology yet, they really aren't uncertain either. It's more unspecified because we haven't looked at that yet. So, all right. So we're good with primary, secondary, in situ, uncertain, unspecified. And of course, benign is the always the desired outcome for any neoplasms. It just looks ugly and it's not going to hurt me. Right?
Yes. But you still want to treat it and still want to watch it because you don't want it to go into being malignant. You kind of want it to be cancer free is the ultimate goal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I get a lot of questions about when someone is being seen today, and maybe they're being seen for their chemo or their radiation. How do we code that diagnosis correctly? What is the reason for the visit?
Exactly. It's the reason for the visit. So if they're coming in for chemotherapy and it's usually like a cancer code, or there's also certain codes in the chapter 3 that may have that as well, or maybe turning to cancer, it's a Z5111. So that's basically telling the insurance company, telling provider that the patient is coming in for neoplastic chemotherapy. So that would be code first, also per the guidelines. Also, if it's like mononuclear antibody, that'd be Z5112. That's also similar to chemotherapy. And then radiation, if they're coming in for radiation therapy, usually that's like radiation oncology, that's C5110. That means they're coming in for treatment, not just having a history of. So you want to make sure that they're actually coming in for that treatment, not that they've already had the history of the chemo or a history of radiation. So that should be primary because that's telling them exactly they are, coming in for this medication or for this infusion or procedure, and this is the reason why it's primary. And then after that, it would be which cancer is being treated for, because sometimes you'll have cancers that are secondary that are being treated for as primary. So that one you want to make sure the second code should be what's treated. For instance, if you have malignant breast cancer and bone cancer metastasized, the patient's coming in for the chemo or for radiation for bone cancer, that'd be secondary, and then the primary would be third, like the breast cancer. So even though it says primary and secondary, there's still a specific order depending on the treatment. So I may be getting a little ahead, but that's usually how we
No. That's exactly where I was going with this.
Okay.
Now, I also heard from different offices, and over the years, you hear things, right? I hear the rumor that you can't code a Z code first because it doesn't get paid.
Certain Z codes you can code first, and this one you have to code first.
Exactly. Yes. So that's what I wanted to remind people, that not all Z codes are bad.
Yes.
It's the reason that they're coming in. And I think that payers expect to see that, in conjunction with the chemo medication that's being reported or the facility claim that's being reported for the administration of the chemo. I think they are expecting to see that Z code that says that was the reason that the patient came in. Now, what about patients that come in for other reasons, again, related to the cancer, but not the cancer? So like an anemic patient that might need to be treated, or a dehydrated patient that
You would
might
add
need
those
to be
codes as
treated.
well. Sometimes you add them as primary. Well, except for the anemia due to cancer, anemia due to the chemotherapy. Those can't be primary because they're actually secondary codes. So you would still code the primary code, and that's a secondary. But that's really good to have because it wouldn't be anemia unspecified, because if the provider documented it's anemia due to any neoplastic or anemia due to chemotherapy, which actually happens a lot. There's usually two codes that go with that. You have the anemia due to chemotherapy, and then the reasoning of like what chemotherapy or what drug. So you would code that, or even for dehydration, sometimes you can code that as primary, because that is able to be a primary code, especially if they're getting additional fluids that are outside of the chemotherapy, because, depending on what's going on or how the patient's doing, they can be, a lot of times I see them being dehydrated with
I'm
all the
glad that you
medications treatment.
mentioned certain codes that can not be reported as primary codes.
Yes.
So I recently did a presentation talking about different denial reasons, and that CO55 for
Yes.
experimental or investigational came up. And I had people say, but, well, wait a minute. I mean, we coded exactly what the doc said. I said, yeah, but you put a primary diagnosis code that isn't allowed to be a primary diagnosis code. Even though it exists, it cannot be a primary. And
Yes.
that's what's kicking that claim back out. So you need to go back to the guidelines. I always tell people, when you meet me, please don't start a drinking game on how often Christine says guidelines. You will lose miserably.
Yes.
A dehydration is in your future, right?
Yes.
So in the guidelines there, it's going to tell us that there are certain sequencing that needs to happen there. And
because it's a manifestation of it. So you got to tell them what happened, and then it manifested in this. I apologize. But if it was just anemia, like the patient just had anemia, that can be primary. But if any other reason why the patient had anemia, like why, like kind of like what you said before, like what's going on, why it happened, who happened. So you got to have like the W questions, I guess, in a sense. When you're growing up, you have all those 5 W's.
Yeah, the 5 W's and the H.
H, I think. Yeah. Who, what, where, when, and how. Oh,
right?
yeah.
How did that H become a W? Anyway, that's for the elementary educators. Y'all got this. I'm gonna back off of that.
I'll learn it again when my youngest goes into kindergarten and first grade.
It's so gorgeous, by the way. I don't know if I've shared with you guys, but I had the pleasure of having lunch with Natasha and Zena over the Christmas holiday, as well as my friend Sarah Reagan, and my friend Becky Poff. Becky
and Caitlin.
Becky and Betty, they're all my friends. I'm very blessed. And my friend Caitlin Brock came down from Indiana, and so we all got to have lunch together, and it was amazing. But Zena definitely stole the show. So
Zena,
tell her I said, hey, send her a shout out.
Yeah, she's in school now, but yeah, she's amazing. She soaks it all. She soaks everything all in. So, and then my oldest likes to quiz me. I'm like, because I told her there's a code for that. So then she tries to quiz me on the codes. I'm like, well, I only know certain codes for certain things. I could tell you, but there's really a code just about everything. And if there's not, there may be a code for that later on.
Well, back in the day, and I know there's some of you on here, and I'm not going to call you out, Betty, but back in the day, like because there were so few ICD-9 codes, we had those memorized. Like in the middle of the night, you would be like, oh, that person had a 250.00 followed by a 311 followed by, like we could call these out, but with almost 80,000 ICD-10 codes now, there's no way. Now, we all have our few that we code on a regular basis repeatedly, but it's not like back in the day.
No.
All right. So another thing I wanted to chat about was, how about leukemias when we're coding those? Actually, let me back up. Let's talk about history of before we get to leukemia. So thanks, Betty. So we talk about history of, and this is one. So I was sharing with you before we went online that the OIG has done 13 audits over the last 5 years of Medicare Advantage plans who have submitted their codes for validation. Now, I love risk, love it. But what they found was there were a lot of cancer codes that were not supported because essentially they were history of.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that a lot?
Yes, or it's vice versa. Like sometimes I'll see the provider says history of, but they're still receiving chemotherapy, they're still receiving radiation, or they're still receiving the medication treatment, especially with like breast cancer and sometimes prostate cancer. They'll receive the remedication for, up to 5 years. So you have to make sure before you do history of, has it been completely, I guess, in a sense, eradicated and modified? Like, that they, take out the organ or remove it, are they receiving any medication, radiation? And then you have to look at the like sometimes, most of the time, provider will say, okay, well, they're still on a Mermotose treatment or still on the SERMs treatment or still on like Lupron for prostate cancer. So if they're on any of those, it's not technically a history because you're still treating them, seeing them. But so for history of is like, they had prostate cancer, it's been removed. Chemo's been done, radiation's done, no more medication. We'll see you in a year, just make sure everything's fine. Great. Then that's like a history of.
Yeah, yeah. And we do have that clear definition, not in this chapter of the guidelines, but if we go to chapter 21 of the guidelines, like there's a really awesome definition of history of there. Again, like you said, Natasha, we're not treating it. We still might monitor it from time to time, but we're not treating it. And so we need to be really careful both ways. I mean, especially in a risk adjustment world where let me back up one more time. I get so excited sometimes that I kind of get ahead of myself.
I'm the same way.
But providers are taught in med school that the word history of has a different definition than it does from the payer world or from the coding world. So sometimes they'll mention that the patient has a history of because they received the information from the patient. They have a history of cancer. They have a history of diabetes. They have a history of hypertension. And as a coder, we're taught to interpret that history of as no longer being treated. But, let's be honest, there's a lot of conditions out there, COPD, CHF, that we haven't found a cure yet for them.
Yeah, there's a lifelong.
Right. And so they're not technically a history of. And that's where a coder may have to use the query process to reach out to a provider and say, hey, I noticed that you mentioned that the cancer is history of, but I also noticed that these medications are still listed as an active medication on their list. Can you please let me know what's the status? What is the current status of that neoplasm or that's being treated? That looks like it's being treated, right?
And that's very good to ask too. When in doubt, ask. And that's the thing too, I've noticed, I don't see very often, is that they have like a history of, cancer, and then it came back and metastasized into a different area. So it's kind of one of those things where, is it really a history of now that it came back and went somewhere else? So that's like the thing that I don't see that very often, but sometimes I still have to look in the guidelines and when in doubt, definitely query, because it's always better safe than assume what's going on.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about leukemia. So that one has a little bit of a different guideline to it as well. Like leukemia goes into remission.
Yes.
And so we're not treating the leukemia anymore, but we're still coding it as an active code in remission.
Yes.
Yes. So
there is a code for that.
Yep. There's a code for that.
There's a code for that. Yeah. And I think that's because with leukemia or anything in the C90s, those can be like the AML and CLL. Those are kind of treated a little bit differently because just it's more like the blood organisms such, or it was like something like be MDS and transferred over. So they always want to make sure like if it's receiving active treatment or they're remission or it's no longer. But I haven't seen too many of it's no longer. It's usually active or remission because you never know what's going to happen with it, because that one's kind of one of those that you can't just take out that organ or do something because it's there.
Exactly. You hit it on the head. I love that definition, Natasha. Thanks. We have a couple of other new guidelines. One is the very last guideline. So if you look at the guidelines every year, you'll notice that when we add new information to that section, it will appear in the text as bold, not the headers of each section. But so this year, one of the additions to this chapter was that they are advising us that the final character for those types of neoplasms that have metastasized beyond the lymph system.
Yes.
Right. So they've gone to another organ beyond the lymph system there. So they're traveling in that lymph system. Not a good cancer.
No.
We're going to report that with a final character of 9.
Mm-hmm.
So that way it identifies that the cancer traveled, metastasized beyond that lymph system there. And
Yes.
I don't know about you, but I love the way that the guidelines continue to provide us with that guidance that we so need in ICD-10 coding.
Especially with this, because some of it can be subjective. So you really, really want to know. And it kind of gives you an idea where you need to go, what you need to do, especially if you code it all the time, because it's always ever changing, where there may be a new cancer, or there may be a new treatment, or there may be an organ where you've never really seen it metastasize somewhere, or an organ that you didn't think could even get cancer and it did. So I really like how it breaks it all down, and it's able to specify and give examples, because you never know. So always refer to your guidelines, especially when in doubt. Even if you memorize it, I still go back to my guidelines. I'm like, wait a minute. Like you said, with the new one, that's changed from last year. So I really got to make sure that we code it, correctly.
Most definitely. And there's always little new nuggets of wisdom. So I know a lot of you have heard me say this over and over again. I probably say it every 2 weeks when we meet, but I really feel like when we read the guidelines, we leave little breadcrumbs in our mind. I couldn't tell you what the guideline is for coding anemia due to secondary neoplasm. Like, I couldn't tell you what exactly it says. But when I see anemia and neoplasm, I immediately remember that there is a guideline. What does it say? I don't remember. I don't have that kind of memory. I wish I did, but I know enough now with that breadcrumb that's left in my mind to go and look at that guideline before I code it.
Yes, so, especially if it's not something you code normally. So me, like, if I was coding cardiology or coding another service line, I would really look at my guidelines, because, like I said, it leaves breadcrumbs. So I know there's a guideline like, hypertension, CHF, and CKD, but I don't remember 100% because I haven't done it so long. Where do I need to go? So like you said, you might know, there's a guideline for it, you just might not know the specifics. It's always really good to go back to it when in doubt.
Yeah. And the way that we reinforce that is by reading them at least once a year. Force yourself. Treat yourself. How about we read the guidelines this weekend with some banana bread?
Oh, that sounds good.
Oh.
And then technically be leaving little breadcrumbs if you don't clean up your mess.
That's perfect. That's perfect.
Sorry.
So, one more thing, we received some new codes this year to be specific on the long-term use of some of those chemotherapy drugs.
Yes.
And I think that's important also when we're coding those neoplasms, especially for those oncologists that are providing monitoring those chemotherapies there, that it's important that we report those new long-term use of chemotherapy drugs that we've been given. So not so generic anymore. There are really some specific codes to represent the different types of chemotherapies that a patient would be receiving.
I like that, because now it's not Z79.899. Now, the Pacitil, the cisplatin, some of them I memorize, some of them I don't. Well, I have it like an area where I can go to, so I know these are the ones that are the new ones. But I like how it all breaks it down, because they're actually a little bit different. Even though they're all chemo, there's actually different chemos who do different things for certain neoplasms, which I think is really, really neat, which I want to start researching a little bit more. But it's not just chemo. It's chemo because of this, or mononuclear because of that. So I like how the medications now, for the long-term use, tell you what's going on, because that also keeps track as well for social determinants of health and physicians. And then also seeing how much medications being used for like the patient, like, okay, well, these group of patients have this, these group of patients have that. And then you can kind of see of how the treatment's working. And so then you can go further with this one, or stop that and go further to the next one. So I really like how they broke it all down. So just the big group, like you were saying, that now it's all switched and changed.
I think it is incredible. And it was very needed, like you said, because there are different chemos that do different things. Yes. And also some of those chemos, we need to monitor them for toxicity, which is one of those areas that affects the level of the evaluation and management.
Definitely.
And so being able to assign that code to support that level, right? And from a payer's perspective, they can easily see not just that they not only do they have the cancer, however, we're also prescribing, monitoring the long-term use of the chemo with that patient, and all of those together paint the medical picture.
Yes.
As my friend Sanal Patel.
I know, I
shares
love
with
that.
us.
Like, you need to like have that trademark. I really love how that is.
She's amazing. She's absolutely amazing. I do. I think that's synonymous with Sanal, is that we
Yes,
hear
it
that
is.
paint the picture, paint that medical picture. Thank you, my friend Sanal, for putting that phrase in our vocabulary on a regular basis, because it truly is. It's so important. And whether you're this particular chapter, whether you're in fee for service type of professional coding, or you are with risk adjustment coding, or you're in the billing department, again, all of this information ties into each other.
Yes, because if it's not billed, coded, or documented correctly, there leads to a lot of denials, and and also you could be doing a diagnosis that the patient has or does not have, and then the insurances are going to be wondering what's going on. So it really affects everybody if it's not coded correctly, not received correctly, not documented correctly. So, and especially this one right here, because any wrong turn and you don't know what's going on as well. And then you can be like, okay, well, this person in this area, there's a lot of cancers, especially if there's something going on, for instance, like, something in the water or lead. So now you have like a whole area where now there's different cancers, but do they really have all those cancers, or is it documented incorrectly? So you want to make sure of what's going on with everything. And we're all playing an important role whenever we're coding, not only this, but with everything.
And you know how surprising it is now, and I'm going to go really deep down a dark hole. So now we have the new law in place that patients have access to all of their original documented information in their medical records, right? They can look beyond the summaries. They can request every part of it. And again, depending on how something's coding, I can only imagine as a patient how distressing it would be if a wrong code was applied. If I received a malignant neoplasm, but was told that it was benign, or it was, we're going to send it off for pathology, and everything was okay. And then I see that C code. And with Google, anybody can translate an ICD-10 code. Let's be honest. I mean,
yes.
My mother does all the time, and she will call me on the phone.
Scary.
Yeah, absolutely. And she'll call me on the phone and she'll say, oh my gosh, I have this disease. And I'm like, Mom, that's not a disease. That diagnosis code just is a status code. It's just saying that, you live alone, or whatever it is. She'll always diagnose herself through her diagnosis codes there. That's a whole nother podcast.
And to go back to the guidelines, when you look in your regular guidelines, also look in the tabular guidelines. Like, I forgot to say that as well, because with breast cancer, they want to know if it's like estrogen positive or ER positive or ER negative. Same for prostate. And then for lung cancer, they want to know if you're a smoker or non-smoker and such. So definitely look, because there's certain cancers that, if able to, they would like these, the additional diagnosis to say what's going on.
Lexi, put that code up by Depeche. The wrong code can waste a lot of time and money.
Yes.
So for my billers out there, it could be a denial that needs to be worked. We need to get documentation, the query process. That was a great thing to post up there, that, again, a wrong code is a waste of time. It's a waste of money. It's a waste of resource. We could be doing so many other things than going backwards and trying to land those errors.
Yeah, I 100% agree, everything's always changing and growing and learning, but that's why it's always best to keep up with it. And even whenever, like, for your reviewing the guidelines, like for me, helpful whenever I'm transferring my notes or re-highlighting and underlining from one book to the other, that really helps me out, because then you can also look, okay, well, this is in from last year, and oh, look, this actually changed. Like you said, it's in bold, but now it really like picks up with it, because I'm like, oh, now I can really see the changes from one book to another.
I do that too. And I think I shared with you earlier, I'm a little bit behind in my transfer of information, but I'm working on it.
I don't know. I see a book.
It's also how we refresh those breadcrumbs.
Yes.
By looking at the notes that we're transferring over. Well, Natasha, our time together
Wow.
has come to an end. I told you it was going to go by so
It
fast.
was. It was like just talking with old friends and then and saying hey to everybody else too. It's really great being here.
If you look below there, you're going to see on the trailer there that we've got Natasha's information. Connect with Natasha on LinkedIn.
Yes.
Right. She has a wonderful wealth of knowledge. And I always tell you guys that we are only as strong as our network.
Mm-hmm.
If you have something that pertains to neoplasms, oncology, hematology, she is your go-to.
And if I don't know, I will help you research and we'll ask. Like you said, it's a network of worth.
Right,
we all know something, so we'll be able to help each other out.
So it's not possible for us to know everything, but together,
yes,
we know it all, right? So thanks so much, Natasha, for joining us today. My best wishes out to Zena. Tell her I said I was thinking about her earlier today, and we have to absolutely get together again. Yes. We live too close to each other to not see each other more often.
I know, definitely. We'll definitely have to get together again.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. I want to thank all my friends that joined us today, and we will see you in 2 weeks.
Yes. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for watching.